In the world of politics and Hollywood, unexpected alliances can sometimes shake up the narrative. But what happens when the youngest member of a political dynasty takes a stand against the media? That's exactly what unfolded when Barron Trump, the youngest son of former President Donald Trump, found himself face to face with a group of reporters determined to twist the story. Their target? His godfather, the legendary Clint Eastwood. It all started at an event in Los Angeles, where Barron and Clint were attending a private gathering. As always, the press was lurking nearby, eager for a headline. They weren't just looking for a story, they were hunting for controversy. The questions started off simple, but it didn't take long before things took a sharp turn. With cameras rolling and microphones shoved in his direction, Barron found himself under fire. The reporters, clearly hoping to rattle him, started throwing loaded questions about Eastwood's political beliefs, his past statements, and his connection to the Trump family. At just 18, many might expect Barron to shrink under the pressure. After all, he has spent most of his life shielded from the public eye. But this time, he wasn't going to let the media spin their usual narrative. With a calm yet firm presence, he met their questions head-on. His response: unexpected, sharp, unapologetic, and in a way that only someone raised in the political spotlight could manage, he completely flipped the script. The reporters, expecting hesitation or a misstep, were left stunned. Clint Eastwood, known for his no-nonsense attitude, simply stood back and watched with a knowing look. The legendary actor and director, who has spent decades dealing with Hollywood's double standards, seemed to recognize what was happening. But even he couldn't have predicted just how well Barron would handle the situation. The moment was tense. The cameras kept rolling, but the tables had turned. Instead of getting a scandalous quote or a fumbled response, the reporters were the ones on the defensive. Barron wasn't just answering their questions, he was exposing their tactics. And in a matter of minutes, he had done something few could have expected. He had shut them down completely. But what exactly did Barron say that left the media speechless? And how did Clint Eastwood react to watching his young godson take charge of the moment? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. The air was thick with tension as the reporters stood frozen, their usual smug confidence wavering. They had expected an easy target, a young man caught off guard, struggling to defend himself and his godfather. But instead, Barron Trump had turned the moment on its head. He wasn't rattled, he wasn't defensive, he was completely in control. The way he carried himself was striking, calm, collected, and direct. His voice was steady, his words sharp but not aggressive. He didn't raise his voice, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to shift the energy of the entire room. Even Clint Eastwood, a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of the quiet stare, looked impressed. One reporter, clearly trying to regain control, pushed forward with another question. This time, they tried to paint Eastwood as out of touch, someone clinging to outdated ideals. Clint has always been known for his tough guy roles, but some say his views no longer fit in today's world, the reporter said, voice dripping with suggestion. Do you think he should step aside and let a new generation take over? Barron didn't even blink. His answer was swift. Respect doesn't have an expiration date, he said simply. If someone has earned it, they don't just lose it because the media decides it's time. There was a brief pause, one of those moments where time seemed to stretch. The reporters exchanged glances, unsure of how to counter his words. Clint, standing off to the side, let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if he had seen this game played one too many times. But the reporters weren't ready to back down just yet. Another one jumped in, shifting the focus. Some people say your family's influence is fading, they prodded. That younger voices are turning away from everything the Trump name represents. What do you say to that? Barron tilted his head slightly, considering his words carefully. Then, with the same steady confidence, he responded, people can say whatever they want, but real influence isn't measured by headlines, it's measured by actions, and that's something time always proves. It was clear the reporters weren't getting what they wanted. Their questions were meant to corner him, to create a headline they could twist into controversy. But Barron wasn't giving them anything they could use. It was supposed to be a normal evening out. J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, had just wrapped up a long day and was looking forward to a quiet meal at a popular restaurant. Nothing fancy, just a place to sit down, relax, and grab a bite. But what happened next took everyone by surprise. As he stepped inside, the atmosphere felt different. There was a tension in the air, almost like the staff had been expecting him, but not in a good way. A hostess approached, but instead of leading him to a table, she hesitated. Then, with a forced smile, she said something that instantly changed the mood. "I'm sorry, but we can't serve you here tonight." For a moment, there was silence. The people nearby, some already seated, some waiting for their turn, turned their heads. J.D. Vance stood there, processing what he had just heard. He wasn't causing a scene. He wasn't being disruptive. He had just walked in like any other customer. So why was he being turned away? At first he thought it was a mistake. Maybe a reservation issue. Maybe they were short on staff. But as the seconds passed, it became clear. This wasn't about logistics. This was personal. The hostess, though trying to keep her voice steady, looked uncomfortable, like she had been instructed to say those words. Vance asked the obvious question, "Why?" Again, hesitation. She glanced toward the manager standing a few feet away. The manager didn't step forward, didn't explain. Instead, they simply watched. And then, under her breath, the hostess admitted, "It's because of who you are." Now, the air grew even thicker. Whispers rippled through the restaurant. Some diners put down their forks, others pulled out their phones, sensing something big was unfolding. J.D. Vance, a sitting U.S. senator, was being denied service, not because of a reservation issue, not because the place was full, but because of his identity, his politics. For a brief second, you could see it in his face, shock, maybe a bit of disappointment. After all, isn't America built on the idea that people, no matter their differences, should be able to coexist, to share a meal without politics getting in the way? But then something unexpected happened. Instead of arguing, instead of raising his voice or calling for a boycott, J.D. Vance did something that caught everyone off guard. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and, well, what he did next left the entire restaurant stunned. And trust me, you won't believe what happened after that. Stay tuned. J.D. Vance stood there for a moment, his face unreadable. The restaurant had fallen into an eerie silence, with nearly every eye in the room locked on him. A few people whispered to each other, their expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. Others just watched, waiting to see how he would react. He wasn't a stranger to criticism. Politics, after all, is a battleground. People disagree, they argue, they take sides. But being turned away from a restaurant, that was different. That wasn't a debate on the Senate floor or a heated exchange on social media. This was real life, happening in real time, and the weight of it pressed down on the entire room. The hostess, clearly uncomfortable, shifted nervously. She wasn't the one making the rules, that much was obvious. Her hands gripped the podium tightly, and she avoided direct eye contact. The manager, still standing a few feet away, seemed unsure whether to step in or stay back. It was as if no one expected J.D. Vance to actually show up that night, and now that he had, they weren't sure how to handle it. Vance finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "So, you're saying I can't eat here because of my politics?" The hostess hesitated again. It wasn't a question she wanted to answer. Finally, she said, "It's just, we've had complaints. Some people don't feel comfortable." There it was. Not a firm policy, not a written rule, just complaints. From who? Customers? Staff? No one was saying. The reasoning was vague, but the decision had already been made. The restaurant doors swung open, and a couple walked in, laughing about something before they realized a strange scene in front of them. They stopped short, looking around, trying to figure out what was going on. Others in the restaurant had pulled out their phones, subtly recording from behind menus or half-full glasses of wine. This was a moment that wasn't going to stay quiet for long. Vance looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces watching him. Some seemed uncomfortable, unsure of where they stood. A few people looked smug, like they approved of what was happening. But there were also others, people who looked just as shocked as he was. A man near the bar, middle-aged with a weathered face, leaned forward slightly, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. A woman at a nearby table gave Vance an apologetic look, shaking her head slightly as if to say, "This isn't right, asterisk." A flicker of surprise crossed the reporter's face. This wasn't the response he had expected. He had set the stage for a defensive answer, something he could twist into another headline. But Barron wasn't playing that game. Another reporter quickly jumped in, sensing an opportunity to regain control. "So, are you saying the media is the enemy?" she pressed, her voice laced with a calculated sharpness. Barron shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I'm saying the truth doesn't always fit the story they want to tell." The words hit hard. A murmur rippled through the room. Clint let out a quiet chuckle, clearly amused by how effortlessly Barron was handling the situation. He had seen this before, how the press worked, how they twisted moments to fit a pre-approved narrative. But watching Barron hold his ground with such composure was something else entirely. The reporters weren't done yet. One of them, growing frustrated, leaned forward, voice dropping into something almost accusatory. "You sound a lot like your father," he said. "Is that intentional?" Barron's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes now, a quiet intensity. He took a step forward, closing the space between himself and the group of reporters. "I sound like myself," he said. "You're the ones trying to compare me to someone else." A thick silence followed. The cameras were still rolling. Every person in the room could feel the energy shifting, crackling like a storm about to break. And then Clint Eastwood, who had been silent for the past few minutes, finally spoke again. He turned his gaze to the reporters, his signature squint tightening just a bit. "You all came here thinking you had the upper hand," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "But it looks like you underestimated the kid." The words sent a wave of unease through the reporters. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They had come to set the stage, to control the narrative. Instead, Barron had flipped the entire moment on them. And yet, something still lingered in the air, an unresolved tension, a sense that this wasn't over. The reporters weren't just going to walk away empty-handed. They needed something. One final push. One last attempt to get what they came for. And as one of them slowly stepped forward, clearing his throat as if preparing to drop a bombshell, Barron and Clint both knew. This was the moment everything would come to a head. The room felt like it was teetering on the edge of something bigger. The reporter who had stepped forward straightened his tie, glancing at his colleagues before locking eyes with Barron. There was something in his expression, something calculated, like he had been saving his real question for the perfect moment. "So, Barron," he started, his voice smooth, but carrying an unmistakable sharpness, "if you are so confident in standing on your own, then why is Clint Eastwood here? Is it because you still need someone to defend you?" The question landed hard. The reporters held their breath, cameras zooming in, waiting to capture even the slightest hesitation. It was a different tactic now, not just questioning Barron's words, but challenging his independence. Trying to make him seem weak. Clint didn't react immediately. He simply shifted his weight, his gaze steady as he waited for Barron's response. But Barron wasn't rattled. He met the reporter's gaze with the same quiet confidence he had maintained all along. "I don't need anyone to defend me," he said. "But respect means standing beside the people who have stood by you. That's not weakness, that's loyalty." The words cut through the air like a blade. The tension deepened. The reporter blinked, as if momentarily thrown off balance, but he wasn't ready to back down yet. "So you admit it," he pressed. "You and Clint are part of the same mindset. the same outdated way of thinking that's losing ground with younger generations. A smirk flickered at the corner of Baron's lips. "You call it outdated," he said, voice calm but firm. "I call it knowing who you are and not apologizing for it." A low chuckle escaped from Clint, his eyes glinting with something between pride and amusement. He had seen people try these tricks on him before. He had spent a lifetime facing down Hollywood's best and worst. But watching Baron handle it, that was something new. But before the moment could settle, another voice broke through the tension, this time from the back of the room. "Then let's test that confidence." Heads turned. A different reporter, one who hadn't spoken yet, stepped forward, his posture more aggressive. He pulled out his phone, holding it up as if preparing to play something. "You talk a big game, Baron," he said, "but how about we let your own words speak for themselves?" And just when it seemed like the moment had finally reached its peak, Clint Eastwood turned toward Baron with a small, knowing smile. "Kid," he said, "I think you just directed your first scene." The reporters, realizing they had lost control, started murmuring among themselves, some already reaching for their phones, no doubt preparing to spin the moment into something else. But it didn't matter, because everyone in that room, everyone watching, knew exactly what had just happened. Baron Trump hadn't just shut them down, he had flipped the entire script. And this time, there was no way to twist the truth. The tension in the room slowly began to unravel, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered. Some of the reporters exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that their carefully planned narrative had slipped right through their fingers. Others had already started typing furiously on their phones, no doubt scrambling to reframe the moment in a way that would still give them something to work with. But there was no denying the truth. Baron Trump hadn't just answered their questions, he had completely dismantled their strategy. Clint Eastwood let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if he had seen this play out 100 times before. "Well," he said, looking around at the speechless reporters, "I think we've had about enough fun for one day." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable amusement in his tone. He had always believed that words were powerful when used the right way, and today, Baron had proven that more than ever. Baron, still standing tall, gave a small nod. "I appreciate your time," he said simply, his voice carrying the same steady confidence he had maintained throughout the entire exchange. "But if there aren't any real questions left, I think we're done here." There was something final in his tone, something that made it clear that the conversation was over, at least on his terms. The reporters knew they wouldn't get anything more out of him. One by one, they started gathering their things, some looking frustrated, others quietly impressed, even if they would never admit it. As the press began to file out, Clint turned to Baron, studying him for a moment. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, "just between the two of them, most people your age would have cracked under that kind of pressure." Baron met his gaze, a hint of a smile finally breaking through. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I grew up watching people try to tear my family down. This wasn't anything new." Clint nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Well," he said, "you handled it better than most politicians I've seen." Baron let out a quiet chuckle at that, but before he could respond, a voice called out from across the room. One last reporter, standing near the exit, looked back at him. "You really think you'll change anything?" she asked, her tone less aggressive than before, but still skeptical. "The media's been doing this for a long time." Baron considered her words for a moment before replying. "Maybe I won't change anything overnight," he admitted, "but I think people are starting to see things for what they really are, and the truth has a way of sticking around, whether you like it or not." The reporter didn't say anything else. She just nodded slightly and walked out with the rest of them, leaving Baron and Clint standing in the now mostly empty room. For a moment, there was silence. Then Clint sighed, shaking his head. "Well, kid," he said, "you just gave them a story they weren't expecting." Baron smirked. "Yeah," he said, "but at least this time, it was the real one." Clint chuckled, clapping a hand on Baron's shoulder. Something tells me this won't be the last time you have to deal with them. Probably not, Baron agreed, but that's fine. I've got time. As they turned to leave, the cameras had stopped rolling, but the moment wasn't lost. It had already made its way out into the world, spreading faster than any scripted headline could. The reporters had come looking for a controversy, but what they had walked away with was something even more powerful, an undeniable moment of truth. And whether they liked it or not, people were going to remember it.